So I feel like Maxland just found a warp pipe, jumped in it, and skipped ahead all the way to year 2025 and dropped their Cinema 4D release 2025.0, and with it, some pretty awesome particle updates. And since we've not talked about particles at all on this channel, let's go ahead and dive into Cinema 4D particles and what you can do with them in Cinema 4D 2025. Let's go! All right, so what we're gonna do is we're just gonna start out with a little bit of an overview on particles, a little crash course, if you will. And while we're covering just how particles works, we're gonna also cover some of those 2025 new features along the way. And most of all, have some fun. So let's go ahead and dive right in. By the way, if you wanna follow along, you can download the project files that goes along with this tutorial. You can find the link in the description below. Let's begin here. You can find all of the particle stuff under the simulate menu, where you can find your old buddy, the old emitter system here. But with the new particle system in Cinema 4D, there's a whole lot of new things, all different types of emitters. You can emit from a mesh, emit from existing particles, emit from splines. There's all these groups, conditions, modifiers, so many things to cover. Let's get started by just creating a basic emitter. And you can see it's much like the old legacy emitter. You can see if I hit play, we're going to get all these little green particles, and let's give ourselves a little bit more time. Always need more time. And we're going to hit play, and you can see there's all of our particles. Now, nothing too exciting yet. Let's dive into what just got added here. So there's two objects that get created with this new emitter system. So the thing to understand is that the basic emitter is holding basically the data of the particles, and this particle group is where the particles are actually getting generated, and you can do different things too. Now, I'll get into a little bit about the whole point and the reasoning behind the particle groups a little bit later, but just be knowing that there are two objects now, okay? So in the basic emitter, you can see here is the shape. We can use a circle. We can use a cube. It's going to emit from all the different faces. We can use a sphere. It's going to emit from all that whole spherical surface there. And then we have a point, which pew, 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 pew. It's like a little video game. It's just shooting from a singular point there. Is it boop, 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 boop. All right, having way too much fun with that. Let's go back to a circle. So we'll emit from a circle. Here you can choose what the start frame is going to be. And here you can choose the emission mode. So you can just have a single shot of particles, and that amount of particles is going to be defined by this count. So I can have 1,000 particles just get shot one time. You can have a constant flow, which is what we had by default. And you can have this pulse, which is going to emit whatever amount of particles that are defined here, and it's going to emit for a duration and then have a gap of a certain duration that you can define here. So a lot of new options in here. You can emit from a certain range. You can change the seed, and in the properties is where you can choose what group these particles, that particle data is going to live in, and that's going to be this particle group that just got added by default. You can change the speed here. You can scroll this down and add a little bit of speed variance here. You can change the direction, the velocity, the alignments. You can add rotation to a particle, the angular velocity. You can change the color here. And then you can change the radius. Now, this is the radius that it will use once you apply any collision to your particles. We'll get into the whole collision kind of stuff a little bit later. But here's your basic settings here. Let's actually bring down the speed a little bit. And now what can we do with particles? We got these particles created. We're in a particle group. You can see that basically this is controlling how they're represented in our viewport. So you can have them represented as arrows, where you can actually see the direction in which they're going, ticks, lines, and little handles, which are basically your little axis handles there. So if you have rotational forces on your particles, these are good representations, either the arrows, ticks, and lines versus just the dots. And here you can see another size option, and this is just how big these particles are going to be in your viewport and when you actually go to render them, because this will render by default using Redshift. So if I go to Redshift Start IPR, you don't have to do anything. These are going to just render. You don't have to apply a tag to them or anything. They're going to render and show up as they do in your viewport here. So we have all these particles. what can we do with these? Well, just like any object, you can apply different types of deformers and stuff to manipulate that geometrical data. And just like you can manipulate geometrical data using deformers, if we go to the simulate menu and go to this modifiers area right here, you can see that these are color coded the same way as deformers, which gives you a little bit of a hint as to what they do. They basically manipulate emitter data. So if we want to do anything to them, like have them collide or follow a spline or stick to a surface or interact with the surface or get attracted to a surface, this is where all of these types of options live. So one of the new things in Cinema 4D 2025 is this follow spline modifier, and it's very aptly named. Basically what you need to do is you have this follow spline. I need a spline to be that target. So I'm going to go to a little helix here, and let's actually rotate this 180 degrees here so it's facing the other direction. And we're going to cast a little Harry Potter spell here. Let's go and shrink the start radius. Let's make the height a little bit longer, and we're going to cast a spell with our little particle emitter wand, and it is going to show all these particles along this spline here. So to do that, we're going to go to the follow spline, drag and drop that helix in there, and if I hit play, voila, we have particles following that spline. Very easy. It's very Cinema 4D-ish the way that the particle system works with the modifiers and all that kind of stuff. And so here is where we can adjust certain things. So you can invert the spline direction if you want to do that, and it'll actually reverse the direction, but this is actually going the right direction. We have all these different modes. This one is going to actually take the existing speed of your emitted particles, which is a speed of 250 with a little bit of speed variance, and it's just going to allow that speed to maintain, and it's basically going to treat this spline as almost like a field force and just kind of like try to change the direction, but it's not going to change the speed. Now, if you choose guide or rail, what that's going to do is it's going to be a force that not only attracts, but also changes the speed of those particles, depending on the value that you have here, whether the attract strength or the follow strength. If I crank up the follow strength, you can see that that's basically the speed in which particles are going to flow along this spline here. So we can bring that down. Now there's guide and rail. Basically the difference between the two is that rail allows you to define a rail spline and actually have your particles kind of rotate and kind of go along with the spline, almost like it's, you're riding like a roller coaster or something like that. So you can actually have the rotation of the way your particles are moving kind of rotate along the spline, as you can kind of see here. And guide is just going to be a guide and have the particles be guided along without changing the particle angle or direction very much outside of just follow this spline. So this mix here is basically a mix between the guide and the rail. So if I bring this down, you can see that the particles are not going to follow so closely. So if you want the particles to kind of follow, but, have a little bit of their own path and not follow so closely the spline, you can bring down that mix. The effect radius is basically how far out from the particle or from the spline are these forces going to attract those splines. So if I bring the effect radius very small, you can see that only the particles that get within 35 centimeters of that spline is going to get sucked in and follow that spline. Okay, so pretty self-explanatory kind of stuff. The attract strength is also something we can kind of bring down, and these particles will kind of flow a little bit less loose. The attract fall off is basically a fall off coming from the center of the spline outward, so you can increase the fall off like so. And then the follow strength I showed is basically, is this going to flow super fast along the spline or slow? So you can it's basically the speed of that particle flow along the spline. So let's just go in and let's adjust the strength to about 1. And we got some kind of cool particles flowing. Now, one thing to know about particles is that they play well with all these existing force objects. So if we want this to look a little bit more organic and flowy, like a little Mography Expelliarmus spell or something like that, we can go into the forces and choose something like turbulence. And so I can go on here. Let's up the turbulence to about like 20 and the scale about 25-ish, and you can see now we have these particles flowing. Let's get a lot more particles in here, by the way. Let's go to emission. Let's bring this up to 5,000. Actually, let me demonstrate how fast the particle system can be. Let's do the old, let's not delete it. Let's see how fast it is without any particles. If we go into the rate and let's choose 1 million, let's go, let's hit play. You can see 1 million particles being generated per second. So you can generate them per frame or per second. And so if you want to know how many particles are in your scene at any given moment, I'll hit escape to pause the playback. I'll select the particle group. And if you go to point mode, you can see there is, wow, that's not lucky. Let's get off that real quick, but there's all the points there. Oh God. So let's rewind. Let's go to the basic emitter and let's go back to 5,000. Let's not use any sixes. That was a little creepy. And let's hit play. We got all these particles. We have the turbulence object doing its thing there. And this is looking like a really cool little casty spell kind of particle thing. Let's give ourselves a little bit more time here as well. 400. And that's looking good. Now, let's go back to the whole concept of particle groups. Let's actually create a whole other particle system. So if I go to emitter, basic emitter, you can see that it also created a particle group as well. So we have a new basic emitter, a new particle group. Now, what is the point of particle groups, you might be asking yourself? Well, if I have this emitter over here, and remember this is basically our second emitter, and let's give it a rate of 5,000 as well. And you can see that when I hit play, all these particles are basically going to be attracted to the spline. Now, if I just wanted either the follow spline or the turbulence to just act upon one particle group, what I would do is just like you would apply a deformer to a single object, you would just go and you would place that object or that deformer as a child of the object you just want to deform and basically isolate with that deformation. So I'm going to do that here as well. And so if I rewind, here is my second particle group. Okay. It's got nothing as a child of its particle group. And if I hit play, you can see that, okay, there's the particles of my second group. And you can see that the follow spline and the turbulence is only affecting that particle group in which we applied and made those modifiers and forces a child of that particle group. So you can kind of see the point of why this is split up into different groups, because I could, if I wanted to, say, you know what? I want the follow spline to do that particle group, but then I want the turbulence to only affect that second group of particles. And so now you can see how you can apply different modifiers, different forces to individual particle groups and be able to fine tune things. So again, these act a lot like deformers, and applying a deformer to multiple objects by having them in the same level of hierarchy, or have them only apply to a single object by making that the deformer or the modifier a child of said particle group. So you want to make it a child of the particle group, not the basic emitter. Okay, so here we got this nice little setup again, and we can start doing other things to it. So one of the cool things about the new particle system, again, is all these different types of modifiers, all the cool things you can do with them. One of the things that you can do is you can remap the colors. So right now the color is actually coming from the color area in the properties. So if I twirl down color, you can see there's that little limey green type of vibe there, but we can go and we can use a modifier, a color mapper. And again, this is going to apply to this particle group because again, it's not in a hierarchy, so it would affect any particle group. But if we just wanted to affect just this one group, we can go and place it underneath there. And you can see what's happening is it's using this gradient, and right now the property is age. So depending on the age of the particle, it's going to apply a different part of this gradient to it. So you can see the older the particle age, which is the upper limit's 30 frames. So once the particle gets to an age of 30 frames, it's going to turn blue, and it's going to go through this gradient until age 30. Now we can up the age here. And as these particles get older and older, let's actually rewind here. We should get a full spectrum of, let's actually go a little bit longer, because then we can get like that full gradient spectrum across this spline. So there we go. That's looking pretty cool. Let's actually choose, I don't know why all the default gradients in a lot of software is just like the ugly. Can we choose the ugliest colors and put them in there? Thanks. But what we can do is actually go and load up a preset. Here we have some nicer gradients. So like this one looks pretty cool. And so let's actually right click and invert that gradient. And now we have this nice kind of thing going on. Let's increase the speed here too. So let's go and grab our basic emitter properties. Let's increase the speed. And so you can see that the speed's going, but then it's kind of slowing down as it reaches that spline. And again, that's because of the follow spline. We can control the actual flow using this follow strength. So if we want things to go a little bit faster, we would up that follow strength. And you can see, whoa, that's a little bit too fast. But let's bring that down. And you can see, there we go, moving a little bit faster. Maybe pull back on that. But we got this really kind of cool effect. We can even go into our basic emitter. Let's change this to a sphere. So this is looking kind of fun. You can see because it's emitting from all sides, you can see that only the particles getting close enough to that spline is going to get sucked in there. So let's actually go back to circle because that's actually aiming right at our spline there. And that's looking pretty dang cool. Now, one of the cool things about this too is instead of using the color mapper to just change the property based on the age of the particle, one thing we can do is do the alignment. We can do distance traveled, the position of a particle. So you can see as it's moving in the X space. So here is my X axis. You can see everything at X0 over to 100 centimeters in the X is going to get that gradient. You can get more of a gradient if I just kind of up that. So you can see that going right there. You can change this to Z, and you can see starting from 0 centimeters in the Z to the upper limit of 634 in the Z, you're going to apply that gradient, which is super cool. Now, you can do the property here, or like there's a velocity speed. So this is kind of like a uniform speed. We don't have a lot of variation of speed, so you're not going to really see all that much. But if we change this to, say, field, we can do something like, get a random field in here and apply all types of different colors. We can color remap this to a gradient, do something like that, or we can just use noise. Now, the problem with just using noise is that it is a static noise. As you can see, it's just kind of stuck there. But if we really crank up this scale, like look at how cool that looks already. And if we go and add a little bit of animation speed, like, yeah, that's looking pretty good. Let's up this to like 5,000. And you can see, maybe bring the animation speed up to 1. You can start to see like, okay, this is looking kind of interesting. Actually, that animation speed is a little bit too crazy. And so you can see like, all right, this looks like some cool kind of like particle spell. Now what we can do is I'll show you a little trick. I showed you that you can just like render this by going to start IPR, and you're going to see that all those colors and everything kind of come in, but you can see that these are basically rendered as just spheres right now, which is not exactly what we want because it's got the shading going on. So we can do one of two things. Number one, we can go into the particle group, we can right click and go to render tags, redshift object. And here you can actually see there's a particle tab. And right now, by default, it's set to disabled. So we're actually not going to see anything at all. But if we go to point instances, you can see that now they're just points. They don't have that like spherical shading or anything like that. And you can adjust the scale multiplier here. So we can go like 0.2. Now we're getting these really fine looking types of almost like sand. Here are the sphere instances that we had before. If I make this super big, you can see that, again, they're just shaded spheres, which kind of looks cruddy. We have quad instances. You can actually, that looks kind of fun. You can put in custom objects if you want to, and it will render those objects at render time. So you can get, Bob the Figure Guy. And let's emit some Bob the Figure Guys here. Scale them down. And that's a lot of Bob the Figure Guys in there. So you get your custom objects, you can randomize through them if you want. So just like if you were gonna do any kind of matrix scattering or anything like that, that's how this kind of works. But let's go and let's choose point instances here, and let's bring down the scale of the particles, and let's actually go and let's get crazy. let's get a lot more of these particles, like 500,000. And let's I don't want to jinx it. I want to hit play first. And then, okay, so there's all our particles. Oh yeah, look at that. That's buttery smooth. And then let's go and get our IPR going. And that's looking pretty awesome. Now, what if we could, like, do blending modes and stuff like that to have anywhere where the particle density is more or having more particles overlapping, have that be brighter than everything else. So we can do that pretty easily using a toon shader. So I'm going to go and grab a toon shader and I'm going to apply that to my particle group here. And you can see something weird's happening because we got to go into our toon shader here. And we're actually going to get rid of all these options here. And what we're going to do is actually just bring in, we're not going to get a contour. Let's remove the contour. So now we just have like a solid white shading going on. So what I actually want to do is get that color that we got from the color mapper here and plug it into our material here. So we can do that easy. I'm going to hit C for our node commander here. And I'm just going to get color user data. And if I grab that, you can see that I can actually sample the data from the particle color and then plug that into anywhere that I want. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to plug this into the emission color. And I'm going to bring up that node by Command or Control clicking, and you'll see that it'll show up there. And I'm just going to plug that color user data into that emission color. And then I just need to bring up the weight. So bring that up to 4. We're going to let the optics RX update there. And you can see that's pretty strong, but we can control the blending between all these particles by going to the opacity. And this is basically like, what kind of shade do we want? So white is 100% opacity and black is 0%. So if I get something in the middle here, you can see as I bring this down, we're kind of wherever the density of those particles are higher, you're going to see that that area is much brighter. We get these really cool kind of, reminds me of the old Mac wallpaper, animated wallpaper kind of screen where you got the little wispy thing going on. Well, 10 years later, after that wallpaper comes out, we can do that in Cinema 4D with the particles. But this is looking pretty cool. So a little bit of a tip, some tips right there, rendering with the toon shader. You wouldn't think the toon shader would, apply to particles, but it does. Toon shader is awesome. Now, I hope you're digging this particle pack tutorial so far, and if you want to learn even more about simulations, including particles and cloth sims and all that type of stuff, and more advanced features in Cinema 4D, check out my newly updated course, Cinema 4D Ascent, that dives into all those type of advanced workflows and tools in Cinema 4D to take your work to the next level. It's part of our core curriculum here at School of Motion. If you want to learn more, you can find the links in the description. So let's go and dive back in, learn some more about this new particle system. Let's get out of our Redshift IPR there, and let's get rid of our Redshift toon and the Redshift object tag, and let's bring down our emitter thing. Let's go through some more things you can do with particles. So let's delete the color mapper and the follow spline. We just got some turbulence now. So one of the cool things we can do with particles is we can apply gravity to them, forces, collisions, stuff like that. So I'm going to go and I'm going to get a plane object, move that down, and let's go up to forces. And again, particles work with all these particle forces. So let's grab gravity. And if I hit play, you can see that now we're just barfing particles all over. Now, it's not colliding into anything. So what I'm going to do is right click, go to simulation tags, and we're going to go to collider body because we want to say, hey, particles collide into this plane object here. So if we rewind and hit play, you can see that nothing's colliding. So in order for particles to collide into collider objects or any other kind of rigid body objects or simulated objects, we actually need to go and add in the simulates menu a modifier that is the collide modifier. So once we do that, and again, because this is living outside of the particle group, if I had multiple particle groups in here, it would apply to everything. So I'm going to go and do that. And so once we hit play now, you can see, whoop, we got all of these particles doing its thing. Now, one of the gotchas here is you can see that there's some weird kind of stuff going on, especially if I go and move this plane over here. You can see there's some like weird glitching and stuff like that. Let's actually bring this particle group up and just have this go down. And you can see we got some bounce going on. And you can see that after a while, it starts all these particles just start going through the bottom of the plane object here. Now, the big important thing about how the modifiers work are exactly like how deformers work in Cinema 4D, where the order of operations in the hierarchy is important, because how Cinema 4D works is the order of operations from top to bottom. So right now, we actually have our collide, or actually our turbulence happening, then our collide, and then our gravity. And the issue we're having here is because we have the collide modifier happening, and then after the collide happens, and it senses, okay, I'm colliding into something, I should bounce, the gravity modifier is going to be applied. And so that's why Cinema 4D gets confused and is like, okay, well, you collided, but then after you collided, I'm applying gravity to you. And so that's why you have some of these particles kind of escaping. And so the only thing to fix this is just simply being like, okay, well, let's have gravity and then have the collision happen after that. And so you're calculating the gravity, and then you're calculating the collide, and now everything's working as it should. So a little bit of a gotcha. Just remember that all these modifier objects, they all depend on the order of operations and how they show up in the hierarchy here, okay? So I could go and place these both underneath the particle group. I'll just go and put the gravity underneath there, because again, if I had another particle group in here, I could have, say, let's go and grab yet another particle group here, and I can hit play, and you'll see that if I move this down, these particles will collide, because the collide is outside of any hierarchy, so it's going to affect everything, all the particle groups. And you can see that the turbulence and gravity is only applied to that particle group that we made children of. So hopefully the whole point of particle groups is hitting home right now. But you can see that we have collision here. And let's actually go to our collide and cover some of the settings here. So we have bounce, and the bounce is super high. Let's bring that low. We have some dynamic friction, which just adds like a drag force once it collides. And you can kind of see here, this looks almost like it could be like water or something like that. But you'll see that although we have some collision, particle collision with the object, we're not seeing collision between particles. Like there's no particles colliding into other particles. And that's kind of one of the downsides of the current particle system as it stands right now. You would think in the future, they're going to want to do fluids and stuff like that. It's kind of the missing piece. But that being said, that they don't have particle collision right now, there is a little trick that you can do to get kind of viscousy type of particle collision stuff. And that is using probably one of my favorite modifiers here. And that is under the simulate menu modifier, we're going to go to flock. Now flock by itself, let's actually turn off gravity, keep the turbulence on, and let's go and angle our particle emitter up here. Just have this kind of face outwards and hit play. All right, so let's go and dive into our flocking settings here. Basically, what a flocking modifier does is allows particles as they get close to one another, allows them to kind of flock together like a flock of seagulls, if you will. And you can adjust the strength here. You can adjust the cohesion strength of how much those particles are going to kind of cohese together. Is cohese a word? I don't know. It is now. So we can up that. We can also do the cohesion radius. So the bigger the radius, you can see these particles are kind of glooping together, and it looks kind of like little water droplets or something like that, which is super fun. So cohesion strength, if we really crank this up to like 100, you can see we got like little tiny drops. Let's actually let's go to like 30, and you can see all these little gloopies. Remember in Harry Potter, he was fighting Voldemort, and like their wands, the energy just kind of turned into like Nickelodeon slime for whatever reason. That's kind of what you can do with this, I guess. So we have the cohesion radius. If I bring this up to 50, you can see it's kind of like all congealing together. So once a particle gets within 50 centimeters of another particle, they're going to flock together, okay? And we'll bring that down to say 10. And so the next part of this is the separation strength. There's kind of like opposing forces. So separation strength, if I bring this out, you can see they're going to spread apart. And if I bring this down, you can see that this is basically right here. The separation radius is how much space, how much personal space is each particle going to have. So if you combine these two things together, you can kind of have a little bit of a radius barrier around particles that if I were going to now aim this emitter at the floor, and let's turn back on that gravity, it looks kind of gacky, you know, which is kind of fun, like kind of like the Nickelodeon slime. And so if I go and kind of look like, let's go down here to the flock and let's bring up that separation radius and the strength. And you can kind of see what's going on there. Let's actually add a little bit of friction too, because you need friction for particles to kind of, you know, stack on top of one another. So let's go to simulate forces and let's grab some friction. And now you can start to see what's going on here. Let's bring the flock underneath there as well. And so now you can start to see there's a little bit of some stuff going on where the particles are looking like they're stacking up on top of one another. And this almost looks like fluid, you know, but it's not quite fluid. So you can kind of see what's going on there. So I really love using the flocking because it allows you to kind of cheat and use all types of different effects to like simulate liquid or maybe sand. So one of the things that's super important when working with particles is the simulation settings. So like the scene-wide settings. If you've used simulation stuff in Cinema 4D before, you know you have the sub-steps settings. And so if I have things I really don't want things to be jittering around like they are right now, what if I wanted them to be, stationary? So why they're kind of sliding around is because our substeps are super low. And so the calculations per frame are very low. So if I go to Control or Command D and then go to simulation, you can see there's the old simulation settings that kind of affect basically everything. But then we have this specific particle area here. And here's the substeps. These are calculations per frame. And watch if I just up this to like 5. How this completely changes the look, and see how the particles settled down there. And so to get rid of all those sliding particles, you basically need to up the substeps. And with upping the substeps, just like with upping the substeps with simulation, it completely changes the look of the simulation. So what I highly recommend you do is just up the substeps from the get-go and then dial in your look, because now look at what we got. We now have that flock looking a lot better, and it looks like we're getting this pile of liquid or something like that. You throw the particle group in a volume builder, volume mesher, you got a little bit of some fake liquidy kind of stuff, which is fun. I'm going to go and I'll rotate this. So we got this kind of sliding going on, and that's looking pretty fun. So hopefully you understand like what the cohesion strength and the separation strength, if we want a little bit more space between those particles. Now this kind of looks like a constant stream of water, and look how thick that is right there. We got a nice little like particle waterfall kind of deal going on. So yeah, one of the big issues with the particles right now is that they don't interact with other particles. They don't collide into each other unless you use this flock kind of workflow. Now, there is one thing you could do to emit objects like particles and have them collide into each other. And it's not great, but if we go and let me just open up a project here. Here I have a little bit of like a scene that I had some like sand falling on my object. So I'm just going to go and I'm going to grab these little sand particles. So if I go and select these objects here, you can see these particles are super small. I'm just going to increase the size of them. And there we go. See, there's our little grains of sand there. And so what I'm going to do is just use dynamics, because if I emit like these sand particles, if I apply a dynamics tag to them, they'll get emitted and they'll apply dynamics and they'll be dynamic sand particles. So what I'm going to do is turn on the cloner. I'm going to say I'm going to clone onto the particle group. So you're going to clone onto the particle group, not the basic emitter. And if I hit play, you can see that there are all the cloned objects being cloned. And I'm going to go to the sand cloner, make sure, yep, random's on, and you can see how that looks like it's got a little bit of space between all those particles, looking good. But again, this is just fake. So if I want to actually have space between these objects and actually have like dynamics applied to these little grains of sand, what I'm going to do is first make sure I am in multi-instance, because we're going to be cloning a lot of these different objects, and having multi-instance on is going to optimize and use a lot of your RAM to kind of speed up that cloned dynamic system. So I'm going to right click, go to simulation tags, rigid body, and hit play. And so now we are emitting dynamic objects here. And you can see already my scene is very slow. And so you can see how that, even though we are now using actual dynamics to have these little sand bits interact dynamically, it's still so slow, even with multi-instances. And we're not even like emitting a ton of stuff. Like we got 5,000. If we want grains of sand, we're going to need a lot more particles than this. Okay. So all that is to say is that while a new edition of Cinema 4D 2025, let me actually bring this to 200, is that dynamic objects will actually now respect the velocity of the particles before they just kind of fall, but now they actually respect the velocity of the particles that are coming out. So you can see how, let's actually up the speed here. Let's go to like 5,000. You can see now they're going to shoot out all those dynamic objects as well. Let's turn off the friction too, because the friction is actually affecting. Yeah, there we go. Now we're just shooting those dynamic rocks there. Let's bring this down. So in the past, dynamics would not affect or get affected by the velocity of particles. In 2025, that is now a thing. So you can kind of see that happening right there. Whee! And so all that's to say, doing dynamics isn't going to work. So that's why with, modern particle systems and stuff like that, which, Cinema 4D is in the midst of developing theirs, there's not that dynamic simulation particle collision upon other particles implemented right now. So that is where we have the flock kind of setup to be able to have something like, thousands of particles. And then what you would do is just clone the objects onto that particle system. Look at that. That's cool. Use the flock to be able to kind of fake the dynamics. Now, one important thing with using this flock system and even collisions is that if I look below, you're seeing all the rocks are kind of going right through there. And that's because our particle size is not as big as the actual objects that are colliding, or the particles that are actually colliding with the floor there. So what you want to do is, just like if you were using rope dynamics or something like that, you want the size of the collision to be the same size of like the circle that you're sweeping along that spline. So all we need to do is just up the size of the emitter particle here by going into the properties, going to radius. Let's go to like 3 and let's rewind. Let's see if this is big enough, because this is going to factor into the collision radius. And now you can see we don't have any of those particles peeking through because the radius of our particle is 3 times as big. And I love how it almost looks like lava kind of flowing, which is super, super cool. I love the flocking because it's super fast. And as we don't have a fluid simulation system in Cinema 4D just yet, this is kind of going to do that thing. And look how it has that nice variety there. Again, that is with this collide, and we got this dynamic friction. We can also change the angle of variation in which the fluids are kind of flowing. You can get a little bit more variation there. And so this is looking pretty awesome. And this is basically how I went and created the little sand render that I did, where it's like sand particles kind of flowing. And what I want to do is I'll just jump into that project file right now. And so now the key differentiator in this scene is that, again, with dynamics, you want to use real world scale, real world values. So if you have a 5 centimeter large piece of sand, that's a rock. That's not a piece of sand. So what I ended up doing was I made those sand pieces a lot smaller. In that basic emitter, I actually brought the radius down to 0.05. So we got tiny grain of sand. And then we have the emitter, we're emitting 40,000 per second. And so what I did is I have my collision. You can see the settings I have in here, a little bit of bounce, really up the dynamic friction there. And then, so if I just hit play at this point, I just have the particles and I am now cloning these objects onto those particles. Now, the friction, I could up that, but this is without the flocking, right? So this just looks like sand blowing all over the place. The other thing I'm going to do is go into the particle, up the substeps. Again, the substeps are huge, make a huge difference in the look of your particle sim. This looks a lot more realistic, but we're kind of getting some weird, unnatural banding there. So like right here, that's looking really weird. We just got these lines of particles. So what we're going to do is we are going to go and we're going to grab that flocking modifier, bring this below. And again, I have all these modifiers, all these forces in the right order, but again, collision being last is the most important thing. So the collision's happening last. And what I'm going to do is go into the flock here. And again, since I'm using very small values, that particle size is again 0.05 centimeters. So I need to keep that in mind when I'm setting all these separation radii and all that kind of stuff. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to need to bring down the separation radius to 0.05, up the separation strength. Let's up the actual strength here of the overall flock effect. And already we got something looking pretty cool. It's like Salt Bae is sprinkling salt on these particles. Another thing I have here is I just added a vibrate tag to the emitter. So it's slowly randomly moving around. If I zoom out enough, you can see exactly what's happening there. As you can see, it's just adding a little bit of motion. And so what we can do at this point is have a lot of fun with like the cohesion strength and maybe bring this up to like, let's try 15. And you can see how this creates kind of like very tight strands. And this looks a little bit less like sand and more like someone's pouring syrup on it. And so that's kind of the interesting thing. We got these little strands of sand. So if it was like wet sand, they'd probably stick together a little bit more. So let's actually bring this down to like 10 and give it a little bit more space there, up the strength. And so if I just pause by hitting escape and zoom in here, you can see that we got no gaps. Well, we got a little bit of a gap, I guess. And again, that is going to be taken into account by the actual radius right here. So we could do one of two things. We can either lower this radius, we could go into the flock here and actually lower this just ever so slightly, or even bring this separation strength down because that's the radius. This is the strength of that effect. And you can see, okay, that's looking like it's sticking a little bit closer. But again, if you're zoomed out, like I was super zoomed out, like this is what I'm rendering, not from there, but I'm going to be rendering from here. You're not going to notice that tiny 0.01 centimeter gap between those objects. Now, if it's big enough, the shading and the shadows are going to look a little bit weird, but this is looking really nice. And you can see we got a little bit of the friction going on there too. And so the flock is awesome. This velocity alignment strength is basically, if you have different particles moving at different speeds, if you up this velocity alignment strength, it's basically going to say like, hey, all particles move at the same speed, congeal together. And you can see how that's kind of working. Again, it's looking a little bit more like a stream of water than some sand particles. And so the velocity alignment radius is, again, like which direction is it turning? Should it all align and flow in the same angle? So you want to play with those settings. This noise is basically like a mat. Think of it as like you're using some turbulence noise and you're using this as a mask effect. And this is basically just going to make this look a little bit more organic, not have the same strength of flock apply to each individual particle there. And so this is looking really nice. Here's the final kind of setup that I got here, where same kind of setup. I have a color mapper that I'm actually using to apply random colors to. So I have my random field. And then what you can do is remap using the color remap here and choosing gradient. And I'm just kind of choosing these little sandy colors to be randomly applied to those little grains of sand. And so basically, you know, pretty much the same setup. We've got gravity, turbulence, friction, that flock. You can see the settings I have in here. And I'll provide these project files that you can download as well. There's the collide. And if we just let this go a little bit longer, I'll show you what this looks like in the IPR. And so this is really a nice particle system because, again, I'm glad that it kind of is beholden to working within the Cinema 4D system where everything kind of makes sense. Thing is, you can get a lot deeper and get a lot more complicated with the particle system because there are things like these conditions and switching particles from one group to the other. And I actually have a tutorial in mind that goes a little bit deeper into all these other particle systems and different things you can do, like mesh emitter, flowing particles along a surface. So if you want to see more particle tutorials from us, definitely let us know in the comments. But there's so many cool things to do. The last thing I want to show you is once you have a particle system set up like this, it is taking a while to actually play back in the viewport. So that's exactly when you have something looking good, you want to go in and utilize the caching system. So if you go to particle group, this is where you'll find the cache system set up here. And so what I'm going to do is you can go, and because I have not only the particles, but I also have all these dynamic objects in my scene, like these rocks have all the collider tags on top of them as well. I'm going to need to go and make sure I say cache scene. And this is going to take a little bit to do, but you can actually see the caching happening in your viewport live, so you can make sure everything's looking good as a cache. If you see something that goes wrong, you can just quickly cancel out of that and then recache. But this system is the one thing I will let you know as well, is it's going to create and bake this into an Alembic file. And these Alembic files can get fairly large. So if I go and I look at the Alembic files here, so you can see these are some of the Alembic files. We're talking one of the biggest ones here is 6.7 gigs. So I have some hard drive space for these Alembic files. But once you cache it, it will create this Alembic file in the same area as your project file, wherever you define your path. And I'm just going to let this simulation do its thing. All right, so we got our particles all cached. You can see that our particle group icon changed from a folder into that little GPU kind of chippy thing. And now you can just kind of scrub through and see exactly what's going on. This is looking pretty dang good, I would say. Got the right amount of like sandy looking properties. And I would say that's looking nice. Now, the thing to note is that when you select the particle group, it is going to show that like thicker representation in your viewport. And when you cache your object, even when you click off of the particle group, you're still going to see that representation. So if you want to just see those objects that we cloned onto those particles, what we're going to do is we're just going to turn off that visibility in the viewport by double clicking that top dot until it turns into that red dot. And now we can actually see what the actual geometry, those sand particles are going to look like when we get in there. And let's choose that frame. Let's go to Start IPR. Let's see what this bad boy looks like. And there you have it. That looks particularly pretty good. Nice little sand, very zen-like scene. You always want to, get in your best zen mind state when you're learning something new. Well, folks, that's a wrap on this particularly exciting tutorial. We've bounced, we've flowed, we've collided our way through the new exciting particle system in Cinema 4D and sprinkled in a little of the Cinema 4D 2025 features as well. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on the new particle system. Have you even had a chance to experiment with it yet? Drop a comment below and let us know. And if you're interested in more particle-based tutorials and less particle-based puns, I'd love to hear what topics you'd like me to cover next. And if you've enjoyed this video, you know what to do. The smashing of the buttons and the like buttons and all that kind of stuff. It's a great way to help you help yourself and never miss out on any of our newest content. You're gonna get alerted anytime we come out with new videos if you just hit the little subscribe button. So until next time, thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.